Story 1. The Old Barn. I was 20 then, but now pushing 30, those wild days seem like a lifetime ago. It's funny how some memories fade while others cling to your mind like burrs. This particular memory, it's one of those that prick me every now and again, especially when I drive past an old rundown structure that should have been demolished years ago. My friends and I were kids in a nowhere town. We were tight. We had the kind of friendship that only small towns can forge, bound together by a shared craving for anything that could break the monotony of our days. I guess you could say that my friend Kyle was the ringleader, always cooking up schemes that teetered on the edge of trouble. He had heard about an abandoned barn a few miles outside of town. Said he'd heard from his old man that weird, creepy things happen out at that barn. Supposedly, a man caught his wife with another man in that barn years ago. Some say he buried them both under the floorboards, I remember Kyle saying. It wasn't true. Nobody was buried out there and there weren't any ghosts. But I knew about the place that he was talking about, and I couldn't deny that there was certainly something creepy about it. Nevertheless, it was something to do, and we were young and craving adventure. So 3 of us found our way into Kyle's truck heading out to the old barn. The road was more holes than dirt, a bumpy ride that had us being tossed against each other, laughing and swearing the whole way. We parked a ways off where we could see the barn in the distance. The light of a full moon gave it that extra touch of eeriness. Just in case we gotta make a quick exit, Kyle said, winking. We piled out and began making our way across the field to the barn. The barn was way bigger up close. Among the 3 of us, we had one flashlight, which I was lucky enough to carry. Upon entering, the smell was the first thing that hit us. It was a thick, overpowering stench of decay. That should have been our warning to turn around and leave, but again, we were very young at the time and not very bright. As we crept in, my flashlight scanned around the interior. The place was dilapidated. It felt like it was over 100 years old. It was barely being held up by rotting wood and honestly, probably could have fallen apart at any moment. We didn't care though. We thought we were invincible, so we pressed on. As we neared the center of the structure, I remember pausing, feeling a cold certainty that eyes were tracking our every move. "I think we're being watched," I whispered, hearing the unease in my own voice. "Probably just some field mice, man," our other friend Matt said. But nobody believed it. All 3 of us felt like we had eyes on us. We edged further in, past remains of someone's past life on a farm. There was a rusted plow, broken stalls, and a tractor seat covered in bird droppings. What we would find at the very back, though, certainly didn't belong to a farmer from past decades. As we inched closer and closer towards the back, the initial stench we had caught wind of when we first entered intensified more and more. As the beam of my flashlight traced down from the back wall onto the floor, we found the source of the stench. There were 2 raccoons and 2 squirrels, together, lifeless and rotting. Their bodies were arranged in a chillingly organized line. It was grotesque, the way they lay there together, and it was clear that they hadn't just wandered in and died. "We should get out of here," I remember saying, the smell making my stomach churn. My suggestion was just an instant too late, though. As I whispered out the words, a soft thud came from the front of the barn, where we had entered. It wasn't very loud, but in the silence of the night, standing in front of what we were looking at, it might as well have been as loud as a crack from a firecracker. It was enough to cause me to drop my flashlight as we all 3 spun around. As the flashlight landed, its beam of light shot out towards the front of the barn. In doing so, it briefly illuminated a figure, dressed in all black, moving in the darkness. We didn't scream, didn't say a word. We ran, pure instinct, scrambling towards a window, and flew out of the barn. For the 3 of us, it was probably the fastest that each of us had ever ran before in our lives. By the time we got back to the truck, I remember my lungs burning as they sucked in the cold air from the night. Each of us were frantic as we drove back into town. As we pulled into Matt's place, we had finally calmed down some. We were exhausted, most likely from the adrenaline dump from the events of the night. We gathered ourselves and talked about what we had just been through for a bit before passing out. It had been a long night. Kyle took the spare bedroom, and I passed out on the couch. At the time, we had no idea that we were in for one last surprise. Come morning, Kyle was the first one out the door. Within a few seconds, he darted back in. "There's a dead raccoon in the back of my truck," he said, his eyes gaping wide. "What?" I said. "You heard me. There's a dead raccoon in the back of my truck," he shot back. He wasn't making it up. We all three went to investigate, and sure enough, there it was. "Was it there when we left the barn last night?" Matt asked. Kyle and I looked at each other. We had no idea. It was an important question. Was the creepy person able to follow us out? If so, then he knew where Matt lived. If not, if it had been placed there while we were parked down from the barn, then it probably served as nothing more than a warning. Looking back, years later, it was most undoubtedly a warning. Nothing else ever came of the barn or the creepy figure inside of it. It was a terrifying night for the three of us, one that I don't think any of us will ever forget. Every now and then, one of us will bring up the story. It's something we kind of laugh about now. Back then, however, it was certainly one of the most terrifying things that each of us had experienced in our younger years. Story 2. Something upstairs. When I was 18, like most kids, I thought I was invincible. You know how it is at that age. Cliff and John were my partners in crime, always up for a challenge, always seeking the next big adrenaline rush. That day, we decided to explore this abandoned house, not too far from the center of our little town. It was a creepy house that most sane people would avoid at all costs. But not us. At least, not on that day. The house was an old, abandoned structure that had been left for dead many years ago. It was a 2-story house with an overgrown lawn and broken-out windows. Its wooden panels were all warped and rotten, and it had gaping holes that stared right back at you. It was the perfect setting for one of those horror movies we used to watch. But to us, it looked like our next adventure. Not having the courage to go at night, we ventured out to the place on a lazy Saturday afternoon. Of the three of us, Cliff seemed to be the most uneasy about it. "We're going to get caught," I remember him saying, but John and I just laughed it off. "Relax," I told him. "Nobody goes down this road." I remember being pretty good about making everyone feel like everything was going to be fine, even if I didn't know for sure. As we parked and got out of the car, we looked around. Just as I had hoped, there was nobody in sight. Stepping inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The floor was covered in debris, and every step we took kicked up clouds of dust. There was no back door, just a gaping hole where a door should have been. You could see footprints in the dust on the floor. We weren't the first adventurers to wander into this place. It looked like it had been a while, though. You could tell by the amount of dust that had begun to fall back over the footprints. There were other prints as well, non-human. It looked like a large dog, probably a stray that had been wandering around in here at some point too. Those looked more recent. As we made our way around, I swore that I began to hear some rustling coming from upstairs. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked. "Yeah, I do," Cliff said. "Maybe we should go." Before he could finish his thought, though, John was already heading up the stairs. "Are you kidding me?" I said. John replied back, "We're already here, we might as well check it out." In my head, I remember thinking to myself that the noise was our cue to leave, not investigate. But that was John. He was always doing things like that. He was a take action before thinking about it type of guy. Reluctantly, Cliff and I followed his lead. As we reached the top of the stairs, the rustling stopped, almost like it sensed us coming. There were 3 doors. One looked to be the entrance to a bathroom, while the other 2 looked to be entrances to bedrooms. There, we took a moment to decide which door we were going to investigate first. But the decision had already been made. From the first bedroom, we heard a low, guttural growl. In my mind, it was definitely time to leave. Now. But once again, John took action without thinking. He slowly crept over and peeked his head into the already open door. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. Cliff and I, rather than asking him what it was, leaned in to get a look for ourselves. There, in the corner of the room, was a dog. But not like any dog I'd ever seen. This thing was massive, its fur matted and dirty, its eyes were wild with aggression. Its lip was curled, exposing its dagger-like canines, and its hackles were standing straight up. For a split second, I thought back to the paw prints downstairs. A dog hadn't been there. A dog was there. What a huge difference. It was growling at a fever pitch now, and we were frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, it let out a loud, reverberating bark. The sound of it shook the entire room. At this moment, we did the one thing we shouldn't have done. We ran. Everyone knows that running typically triggers an aggressive animal's natural instincts. Nevertheless, it's what we did. It lunged at us, barking and snapping its jaws. We turned and ran down the stairs. All I remember was running as fast as my legs could take me, doing everything I could to put distance in between the canine and me without falling and breaking my neck. John was in the back, and he was screaming as loud as he could for us to move faster. We could almost feel the breath of this thing spilling over our backs. None of us looked behind us as we burst out of the front door. Each of us lunged for the car, frantically pulling at the handles to open the doors. Safely inside, we peeled away, never to return to that place again. It was a terrifying experience that none of us have ever forgotten. Any of us could have been seriously injured or worse if that dog had managed to clamp its jaws around one of us. Speeding away in the safety of the car, the reality of what had just happened hit us. We were shaking and laughing nervously. It was a close call. Too close. I don't blame the dog for trying to defend itself, though. It had probably been a stray for a long time and had many encounters. At the end of the day, we had cornered it, even if it was unintentional. I learned my lesson that day, and it was the last day that I ever stepped foot into any kind of abandoned structure. Sometimes you wander into places and find nothing. Other times you find more than what you bargained for. Story 3. School's Out. I'll never forget that night when I was 19, the night when boredom led my friend Josh and me down a path we'd come to regret. It was one of those evenings that stretched out like a road to nowhere. We were lounging around in Josh's cramped apartment, flipping through channels, dismissing every form of digital entertainment when the idea struck. Let's check out the abandoned school a few blocks away. We'd been there before during daylight, poking around the decrepit classrooms and the musty gym. It was unsettling even then, but the cover of dark, we figured, would drape it in a whole new level of eerie. So just after 1 a.m., with the streets quiet and the world asleep, we ventured out. It was autumn, and the air was cool as we cut through the woods on our walk to the school. The school was a hulking silhouette in the night. Its broken windows looked like jagged teeth in a gaping mouth. As we slipped inside, the beam of our flashlights revealed the havoc wreaked by time and neglect. Graffiti was scrawled across walls, trash littered the floors, and the pungent stench of mold filled the air. We meandered through the gym. Its once polished floor now just looked like a canvas of decay. The cafeteria, which once held the laughter of hundreds of children, now only held silence. It was fascinating in a grim sort of way, this glimpse into a place that was once brimming with life. But as the novelty wore off and our amusement faded, we decided we'd had enough thrills for one night. We were about to head out when a noise echoed from down a hallway, a crash that ricocheted off the walls. I tried to dismiss it as an animal or some stray cat or something, but Josh, ever the curious one, wouldn't have it. He was convinced it was something more. "Let's just check it out," he insisted. We went lights off and crept toward the sound. As we got closer, we heard voices, gruff and low, definitely not animals. We inched closer, and that's when we saw a flashlight's beam bouncing off the metal of a locker. Peeking around the corner, we strained to see what they were doing. There were two men, and they looked tall and menacing. It looked like they were trying to pry open a jammed locker. One man held a flashlight while the other wrestled with it. "Keep it quiet," the man with the flashlight said. "You want to do this?" the other man replied. "What are they doing?" Josh whispered over to me. But before I could answer, the beam of light from the man's flashlight hit both of us square in our faces. "What the hell?" a voice growled. Panic seized us, instinct took over, and we ran. We sprinted down the hallway, doing our best not to stumble over the debris on the floor. The men pursued us, their footsteps sounding like gunshots coming down the dark hall. Bursting from the school's entrance, we dashed for the woods as fast as we could go. Amidst the chaos, I took a quick look over my shoulder to see that the men were still in pursuit. Fear and shock tore through Josh and me as we finally reached the woods and began to tear through them. Twigs snapped under our feet, and branches clawed at our clothes. The men's shouts faded as we made our way deeper and deeper into the woods. Taking a moment to finally catch our breath, we turned to look and caught sight of the men's flashlights stopping at the wood line. They were either deterred by the thought of getting lost, or simply decided that we weren't worth the trouble. For us, we didn't care. They had stopped their pursuit, and that's all that mattered. Not wanting to press our luck, Josh and I continued until we finally reached his apartment. Once inside, we were an absolute mess. We were panting, sweating, and shaking. We never returned to the school. I guess the fear of crossing paths with those men again kept us away. I always wondered what was in that locker, though. Was it money? Maybe drugs? Or something else? Whatever it was, those men didn't want us to know about it. That abandoned school, once a sanctuary for hundreds of children, now holds, it seems, a little bit more than just a few stories from the past.